It is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker. And I'll just say, I've known Erwin for a while, and in this past March, for the first time in 30 years, the National Science Foundation created a new directorate, the Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, or the TIP Directorate. And the goal of TIP is to rapidly bring new technologies to market and address the most pressing societal and economic challenges of our time. And I'll just tell you, I see Tom Peterson here. Tom and I were at the NSF years ago, and we talked a lot about NSF providing the building blocks of innovation, but not taking that next step. And Tom, you gave a talk once on the Valley of Death, which I still remember. And Erwin is here to help fill that, that Valley of Death, where between ideation and taking things to the next level. So I'm really excited by this. And would say that NSF wisely chose Erwin to lead this new directorate. He's been there since 2012, just around the time that I left the NSF. He served in a number of leadership capacities, largely in the Directorate of Computer and Information Science and Engineering program. He's been the acting assistant director. He's been very often the deputy assistant director. And for those of you who know NSF, the deputy assistant directors are the ones who make the foundation actually run. And so he's an example, and now he's in a leadership role in this. And I'm really pleased to welcome you here. Thanks.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Oh, come on, we can do better than that. Good afternoon, everybody. There we go. All right, so thanks very much for that kind introduction, Ed. And it is a pleasure to be with you all today. As Ed alluded, I did manage to get here just in the nick of time with flights and everything these days, but I am delighted to be able to be a part of the Mountain West Innovation Summit and to be able to talk about this new directorate at the National Science Foundation and how I hope this new directorate can intersect with all of you and with the greater Mountain West as we think about ways in which we can really harness the geography of innovation that the panel just before me spoke so eloquently about. So just as a little bit of context, Ed mentioned this, I've been at the foundation for almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years in September. So not quite as long as the last time that NSF stood up a new directorate 32 years ago. But I will say that for myself and for all of us at NSF, this is a transformative moment. And I hope that over the course of the next 45 minutes, we can talk a little bit about how it's a transformative moment, what's allowed us to be able to stand up this new directorate, and then also talk about a little bit the mission, the vision for the directorate, and then again, how some of the programmatics, I think, really intersect with all of you and with the broader country really as a whole. So I'm going to start with a little bit of inspiration and mission that leads to the establishment of this directorate. And then I'll talk a little bit about the vision for the directorate as well. And then I'm going to really spotlight some of the key functions and how those functions themselves spotlight place-based innovation and really trying to think deeply and intentionally about workforce development that goes beyond sort of the workforce development that I think we have been working on for quite some time, but really intentionally focuses in on folks at all different levels and in all different points in their lives as well. So let me first start with the NSF mission. I know it's a little bit of a boring slide. Many of you know the National Science Foundation. Certainly the two former assistant directors of NSF know the foundation's mission. But I put this up with intention, right? I put this up because oftentimes when I'm out giving talks about this new directorate, I get a little bit of pushback that, oh, you're moving away from the mission of the National Science Foundation. So I put this up so that we can just remind ourselves that for 72 years of the foundation's existence, our sole purpose has been to promote the progress of science, to advance the nation's health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. And I hope that as you see the rest of these slides, as you hear me talk, as I show a Valley of Death slide at the very end, if I have time and get to it, I hope that you will see that this mission is still what drives us. And we implement that mission on a day-to-day basis by virtue of supporting all of the frontiers of science and engineering, from biology to computer science, my old stomping grounds, to math and physical sciences, Ed's old stomping grounds, to geosciences, to social behavioral economic sciences, really every discipline of science and engineering with the exception of medical research, since that tends to be the purview of our colleagues up the street from us at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. So when you think about that area, that expanse of science and engineering that we support, I often put this slide up as Pasteur's quadrant, right? The proverbial Pasteur's quadrant, right? The spectrum of research that we support, we collectively, meaning government, academia, industry working together. And NSF has generally operated in the top half of this chart. We've supported basic research, and we will continue to forevermore support basic research. But we support that full spectrum from pure basic curiosity-driven research to much more use-inspired basic research as well. So let me give you a couple of examples. About 4 weeks ago, we were proud to, as part of a multinational collaboration, announce that we identified the black hole in the Milky Way galaxy, right? Ed and others will tell you that there's a lot of technology that underpinned our ability to be able to actually identify and map that black hole and visualize it. But at the end of the day, it is 20, 30 years of curiosity-driven science that led us to the identification of this black hole. On the other end of the spectrum, I'll just point to COVID-19. It was mentioned toward the end of that last panel, right? When we think about this virus, when we think about SARS-CoV-2, when we think about all of the variants, shortly after this being declared a pandemic, NSF invested more than $200 million in hundreds of projects all across the country to better understand the molecular structure of the virus, to better understand the spike protein that allows for the virus to be able to be so effective at transmitting, to better understand how it transmits, and what are the behavioral cues that motivate people to change and adapt and adjust to this virus. So that's the full spectrum of basic research that NSF has long supported, from curiosity-driven to much more use-inspired, solution-oriented research. But there's another piece, and this comes back to that valley of death that Ed referenced, which is on the bottom left-hand corner, there's a third dimension on this chart, translation and innovation. And this third dimension is about our ability to be able to take the research that we support across that full spectrum, from pure basic to use-inspired basic research, and to be able to accelerate the translation of that research into practical societal solutions, into adoption in the marketplace and beyond, right? And those are the three spaces, if you will, on this chart that NSF has long operated in and continues to operate in. What we don't do is pure applied research, which tends to be the purview of our colleagues at mission agencies like DOE, DOD, and others, though we certainly try to collaborate and build bridges between NSF and those agencies as well. And so just as an example, I'll take artificial intelligence, right? If you look at any one of these verticals in AI, they really constitute different eras, right? From NSF investments in the 1970s around machine learning or natural language processing that today are resulting in the form of computer vision capabilities or speech recognition software. The proverbial example that I give is when you go home tonight, or when you go home at the end of this trip, depending on where you might be from, and you have an opportunity to sign on to your favorite streaming service, that recommendation engine is the result that recommends which movie or show you should watch next. That is the result of basic research that NSF supported many, many decades ago, right? And so it has historically taken us decades to be able to achieve the types of innovations that we see in AI, in quantum, in the life sciences, biotechnology, and so forth. And part of what we want to do as we think about that spectrum of basic research, and as we think about the translation of that research, is to see if we can shorten that lifetime, shorten that scale of impact to impact in terms of the investments that we make. And so with that as a little bit of context, I heard it actually in the panel just now, how this is a pivotal moment, how the world today looks very different than it did 5 years ago. The world today looks very different than it did 3 years ago. In fact, when we think about some of the talent that's flowing into our colleges and universities across the country who have seen how science has had a huge role in helping to address the pandemic and look at science very differently, right? But we are faced with a pivotal moment, whether it be climate change, in terms of wildfires or droughts or hurricanes or destructive storms, equity and the inequities that exist in terms of access to healthcare or access to education, or even simply access to broadband connectivity. or the need for critical and resilient infrastructure. We saw what happened in Texas, for example, about a year and a half ago after a winter storm blew through and knocked out the power grid, and lives were lost as a result of that. So we're faced with a pivotal moment, and we're also seeing at the same time, not only are we experiencing societal and economic challenges, but we're in a hunt for intense global competition right now. Right? Be it other countries in terms of their approach that they're taking with trying to aspire to develop key technologies, be it in terms of their ability to be able to outmaneuver our country in that regard. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of bipartisan support on the Hill in the administration for basic research, for science and engineering actually paving its way to new technologies and new solutions. And perhaps more than ever before, there's a realization that we, for too long, out of NSF and out of funding agencies, have focused on the coasts and the big cities and the urban environments and the big schools, and we have not paid attention to the full expanse of the geography of the country and the unique challenges and characteristics that you see across that geography of the country. And so at the same time as that pivotal moment is manifesting, we also are witness to a changing science and engineering enterprise, right? So I would argue that if you think about any field of science and engineering over the course of the last 5 or 10 years, and you think about how that field is changing, the pace of discovery is dramatically accelerating because of access to unprecedented amounts of data from sensors, from experimental assays, and so forth, as well as access to emerging technologies like machine learning or AI that allow us to be able to harness that data and analyze that data in real time and draw out predictive insights. I just talked about early career students and faculty who are going into STEM because they feel that this is a moment where they can actually they can study, they can do research, and that research can have a positive impact on society writ large. And if we think about where talent ends up, and here I'm talking about talent at all levels, not just PhD talent, but talent at the master's level, at the bachelor's level, at the community college level, at the K through 12 level. Really meeting talent where it is, that talent is distributed across sectors. Gone are the days where we only prepare students to be academics, but we see talent in industry, at national labs. We see talent in state and local and tribal governments. We see talent everywhere. And so there's an opportunity for us to be able to leverage that talent in the form of blended teams that allow us to be able to, through partnership, really drive forward progress in this changing science and engineering enterprise. And so if I go back to past year's quadrant for a second, with that defining moment that we face today in terms of societal challenges, in terms of intense global competition, in terms of a recognition on both sides of the political spectrum of all of that, as well as the changing science and engineering enterprise, I'd argue that we have an opportunity to be able to put a spotlight specifically on the use-inspired research and the translational work that NSF has long supported, but perhaps hasn't emphasized in terms of the conversation and the dialogue about the work that we are funding all across this country. And so if I think about NSF's existing directorates today, it's a honeycomb because there's a lot of intentional collaboration that takes place across these directorates. Our cybersecurity portfolio involves 5 of these directorates. Our clean energy portfolio involves a number of directorates across the foundation. We see this new Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, or TIP, as a horizontal that stretches across all of those directorates, partners with all of those directorates, and specifically seeks to, as my boss would say, strengthen and scale the use-inspired and translational research that we're doing to varying degrees, but that we recognize we need to do more of across the country. Now, I want to stress that this is not about taking us away from our core mission, but rather doubling down on a part of that mission that we seek to really emphasize in the moment that we face right now. And so another way of describing this, another way of characterizing this, is a little bit of a paradigm shift. So for years, a lot of NSF's investments have largely been investigator-driven science. So faculty members in academic institutions, some of you around the room, right? It has resulted in a steady stream of discoveries that have improved our quality of life. And again, we want to do more of that. And let me stress that this is sort of broad brushstrokes, right? For every statement I make on the left-hand side, you can probably find examples of things we're already doing on the right-hand side, but broad brushstrokes, if you bear with me. So what we'd like to see with this new directorate is really putting a spotlight on the users of the research, the consumers, the beneficiaries of the science and engineering that we want to support, to bring the community to the fore in many respects, to be able to help shape the research directions, to partner hand in glove with our researchers, to be able to drive forward progress, to pilot, to prototype, to experiment in the wild with solutions, and to then be able to repeat that process iteratively all over again as we learn new lessons from those research-based solutions. So this is about multi-sector teams that really intentionally bring together academia and industry and civil society and government at all levels and communities of practice to really be able to put a spotlight on what are the important and pressing societal and economic challenges that we face here and now, and how can we have those drive the research directions and the research agenda that we're trying to pursue through this directorate at NSF. So in many ways, a lot of what NSF has done successfully is what I would call technology push. Great ideas, great researchers, great students, great outcomes, and now we want to push that out to the market. And what we want to do with this directorate is to bring the market to the table, to bring all of you from your varied perspectives to the table, to engage in the conversation from the start, to shape the research, and in turn to allow us to be able to accelerate the pull back into the market of those research-based solutions. And so that, in a nutshell, is how we are thinking about this directorate and how we see this directorate as being able to advance three key goals for the foundation right now: advancing science and technology while addressing our national and societal and economic needs, being able to provide opportunity everywhere. You'll hear me talk about the Regional Innovation Engines program and other efforts that we have that are really meant to try to go where the problems are, really harness that geography of innovation, not just where the problems are, but where the talent is as well. And finally, by doing all of that, being able to ensure that we continue as a country to be in the vanguard of competitiveness when it comes to key technology areas like AI or wireless or biotech or quantum and so forth. And so that is the motivation, that in many ways is the inspiration that led us back in the middle of March to establish this new directorate for technology, innovation, and partnerships, first time in 32 years. And we build it then, and we build it again today as a critical first step to being able to accelerate the development of new products and services that benefit our livelihoods across this country. But it's a first step. And we look to Congress and others to be able to provide us with the resourcing that we need to really be able to deliver on the vision that I just described for this new directorate. And that is what you see in the President's FY 2023 budget request for the foundation, which calls for a close to 20% increase for NSF. And as part of that 20% increase, funds the TIP directorate at close to $900 million, a starting point out of the gates, if you will. And you can see that as part of the investments through TIP, but also investments through our sister directorates across the foundation, significant investments in areas of key technologies like wireless and quantum and microelectronics and semiconductors, trying to address the supply chain challenges that we just talked about as well. I think a really important point here is that when you think about that 20% increase for the foundation, that's about a $1.7 billion augmentation for the NSF budget. Of that $1.7 billion, about $500 million goes into the TIP directorate as new money. The rest are existing programs, as I'll talk about. So this is not robbing Peter to pay Paul. This is not taking from basic science to support this. This is a rising tide lifts all boats types of approach that we have in mind for the TIP directorate. So I hope that that gives you a sense of sort of what inspired us to move along this trajectory. What is the mission and the vision space for the directorate? And then I'm going to take a little bit of my time now to provide some examples of some of the key functions and some of the key programs tied to those functions that we hope to have out of this directorate and that we hope will intersect with your interests and your efforts as well. So first, for us, partnerships really serves as a foundational building block for this new directorate. For us to be able to bring the consumers, the users, the beneficiaries of the research to the table, it's going to require partnerships across sectors and across geographic and geopolitical boundaries as well. Glad to hear that we have international partners in the room, for example. An example of the partnerships that I'm talking about, just earlier this year, NSF announced a collaboration with the Intel Corporation. So this is a direct partnership between NSF and a private sector company. We also hope that our investments will catalyze partnerships that you all will enter into as well. But in this case, Intel announced that it would be investing $20 billion in Ohio in a couple of new chip making factories there. And as part of that, they've partnered with us on a $100 million agenda over the next several years to support semiconductor design and manufacturing at colleges and universities all across the country. And the point here is that we have a particular focus on community colleges through this effort, trying to be able to think about curricular innovation and instructional materials at community colleges so that we can train the next generation of talent that's going to be on the manufacturing floors, the next generation of talent that's going to help all the way on the research side as well with innovating in terms of new chip designs of the future as well. So partnerships really serve as a building block for us. Feeding off of those partnerships is an innovation and technology ecosystem, bringing together all of these different actors who can help drive forward progress in a particular research agenda in a particular technology area. And here we have some existing programs that some of you may be aware of, like the Convergence Accelerator, that's transitioning into this directorate because it focuses on use-inspired research and on translational work as well. So for example, since 2019, the Convergence Accelerator has supported close to a dozen tracks now that cover topic areas from open knowledge networks that allow us to drive the next generation of AI technology, to how are we thinking about quantum computing platforms of the future, to how are we enhancing opportunities for persons with disabilities through novel technologies that can be brought to bear so that persons with disabilities can feel as though they're an equal part of society going forward. So just some examples of sort of the use-inspired flavor of the work in this sort of functional aspect, and also the key goal here of bringing together multiple stakeholders from different sectors to help drive progress in each of these areas. And we look to do more of that through this directorate as well. But we also call for new investments that spotlight emerging technologies and regional innovation, as well as experiential and entrepreneurial learning opportunities too. So I'm going to come back on regional innovation in a moment, but since I won't come back to experiential and entrepreneurial learning in too much detail later, I just want to emphasize that one of our key goals with this directorate is not just to focus on the research, but also to focus on the education and workforce development piece. So how do we think about providing students at all levels with those practical experiential opportunities that bring companies, for example, to the bear with internships and externships that can complement what students might be learning in the classroom, and can allow students to be better prepared for jobs on day one, and also find pathways through those experiential and entrepreneurial learning opportunities to the jobs that they take on in the future as well. And then finally, one layer above that innovation and technology ecosystems tranche is technology translation. And here for us is thinking about lab to market. So we at NSF, as some of you may know, have long had a lab to market platform. We've supported small businesses through the Small Business Innovation Research Program since the 1970s. We've supported entrepreneurial education through the I-Corps program since the 2010s. But for us, it's about building that lab to market platform out, but also thinking about the innovative pathways to societal impact. How can NSF funded research actually be adopted by local and state governments? How can we create pathways for that adoption? How can NSF funded research find its way into some of the policy making and regulatory making that federal agencies do? Ecological research that can help to inform the EPA's efforts, biotechnology research, for instance, that can help to inform some of the policy making that HHS pursues and so forth. So creating these additional pathways that allow us to be able to really do lab to X, not just lab to market, but lab to society and economy more generally as well, is a key goal for us within this new directorate. And so let me just touch on a couple of, or maybe one particular program that I think many of you have heard a lot about, and that really is core to our thinking here in the TIP Directorate, because it tries to package all of that together: partnerships, innovation ecosystems, and thinking about sort of that place-based innovation that can drive technology translation as well. And that is the Regional Innovation Engines program that we've talked about. So where do the regional innovation engines come from, right? There's all this talk about how Congress in Washington is really focused on the National Science Foundation, focused on these days, it's called the Bipartisan Innovation Act, trying to be able to deliver funding for the CHIPS Act, also deliver authorizations for NSF in terms of new programs. And there's also a lot of talk about how there's space, and sometimes too much space, between the Senate and the House, or between the Republicans and the Democrats. So I put up this slide and the next one to try to give you my take on that space for what it's worth. So this is language from the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which, as you can see in the graphic, has passed the Senate with a bipartisan vote. And as part of the act, it calls out for the National Science Foundation to have its director establish a program that makes awards to university technology centers. And the goal for these university technology centers is to be able to support multidisciplinary research across key technology focus areas, spanning multiple sectors, and really growing the capacity for education and entrepreneurial work as well. Things and themes that I've been talking about throughout this talk. So that's the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. America Competes 2022, this has passed the House, also by a pretty wide margin, pretty bipartisan, significant bipartisan support for America Competes at the end of the day. This particular bill calls on the director to establish technology research institutes, so university tech centers, technology research institutes, but specifically to support fundamental research to advance innovation in key technologies, to solve societal and economic challenges in partnership with other agencies and other sectors, and while growing capacity through research experiences in industry and government for our students. If I look at that language, there's actually a lot of similarity, a lot of parallels between the two bits of language. We can't agree on what to call the program. NSF has its own term because everybody in Washington needs to have their own stamp on the name of the program. But in general, when you think about what is it that we're trying to do, the themes are essentially very well aligned. And so that as motivation, in part, along with conversations that we've had with the community, that is what led us to establish the NSF Regional Innovation Engines, or NSF Engines program, about a month and a half ago. And our goal with this program is specifically to be able to cultivate new innovation ecosystems at the scale of regions. We leave that to you all to define, but at the scale of regions all across the country, with a particular focus on those regions that have not benefited from the technological booms that we've seen over the course of the last several decades. And our goal with the Engines program really is to be able to marry both scientific and technological challenges with societal challenges. So you see on this slide a set of key technology areas at the bottom: AI, quantum, biotech, wireless, and so forth. And you see at the top different clouds that speak to some of the societal challenges that I talked about a few slides ago: climate change, equity, critical infrastructure. You could plug in your technology area, you could plug in your societal or economic challenge, whatever is specific to a particular region. But the point here is that there's bidirectionality. The way we think about critical infrastructure inspires research questions in AI or wireless and sensing and so forth. And as we have innovations in those areas, that's going to give us new lenses as we think about some of these societal and economic challenges. So we're really looking for that bidirectionality in the Engines proposals. We're also very interested in balancing both the technical innovation and the geographic innovation as well. Again, I can't stress this enough that geography matters. The challenges that we face in particular parts of the country around climate change are very different than other parts of the country. And so there's opportunity for us to think about engines, for instance, that focus on the climate or a resilient planet, let's say, across the country, that take very different cuts, but that actually ultimately may work together because the whole will ultimately be greater than the sum of the individual parts in that way. And so with this kind of approach, this is intentionally very different. It's very different for NSF, and it's very different for the community that we've traditionally supported. It's different in terms of scale. We're talking about an investment to the tune of $160 million over a 10-year horizon. It's different in terms of that use-inspired and translational emphasis. We want the users, the consumers, the beneficiaries at the table from the very beginning. We want to foster and engender co-design and co-creation. And we want to be able to see a scenario whereby ultimately you have a cohort of engines that come together and can share perspectives across different geographies, across different technology areas, and even across different societal and economic challenge areas as well. But for this to be successful, success also has to look different, right? This is not about strictly publications and conference proceedings, the usual requirements for tenure at our institutions across the country. This is instead about that focus on regional development. It's about thinking through how do we scale and sustain the investments that NSF might make here. So does that particular engine operating in a region offer such significant impact to that region that the region itself over time is now pouring in additional resources, investing, co-investing into this engine for longer term sustainability? We want to understand what are the technological outputs that are going to be delivered. And we want to understand what's the workforce that's going to be trained. And from the workforce perspective, I can't stress it enough about meeting folks where they are. It's okay for folks to get a community college degree and go off and be significant contributors to our nation's economy. Many folks do, and we should inspire them. We should engage them in STEM. We should keep them in STEM. We should inspire them in STEM, and we should keep them moving forward with their degree and their competencies so that they can be a part of that lifeblood of innovation all across our country. And so the outputs here, the success metrics, are very different in terms of that focus, much more on the impact to the region, that place-based innovation, and the technological and workforce outputs that result from that engine and that ecosystem that we want to build out. And so if I give you an illustration of what this looks like across the country today, right? I've used this slide before with intention. I intentionally try to not pick a community that I'm visiting. So, Pittsburgh, for example, right? Many of you know about Pittsburgh and how there's a robotics ecosystem that's concentrated around the universities there. Small businesses, startups, big companies that have congregated around Pittsburgh as well. Nashville, Tennessee, and the medical device industry that exists there around Vanderbilt and some of the other universities and community colleges. Chattanooga, Tennessee. So some of you may know the story of Chattanooga about a decade ago deploying high-speed fiber to help with their electric power distribution. That high-speed fiber is now the basis for effectively a gig economy. I know that sometimes has bad connotation, but a gig economy where you have startups and small businesses that have congregated and really been catalyzed through that ecosystem. And Huntsville, Alabama, and the military and defense base that you see, and the industry that you see that's congregated around the Air Force Base there. So those are 4-point examples. Could have identified something strictly on the coasts like Silicon Valley or Kendall Square, but I'm trying to be intentional about sort of expanding that geography of innovation. And that is our goal with the NSF Engines program, to be able to replicate the successes that we see in point locations across the country, all across the country, and recognizing that what makes any one of these innovation ecosystems successful is unique and different. But if NSF can provide significant infusion of funding and a framework along the lines of what I described on the previous slide, can that be a magnet that attracts in co-investment and co-creation? And can that be a magnet that allows us to be able to sustain, promulgate and then sustain these innovation ecosystems in these different parts of the country as well? There's one on Wyoming, by the way, just for the record. So what is an NSF engine then, right? It is about trying to bring together this multi-sector coalition of regional partners. It's about trying to have at its core, right, a CEO type, a full-time dedicated leader and team bringing in partners from across different sectors so that they can together catalyze this regional innovation engine that over time grows, sustains, endures, and allows us to, for once, truly harness the geography of innovation that exists across the country. And so I just encourage those of you who have not already checked it out, please do check out this program. We've run a series of road shows regionally all across the country. Please don't take any significance to how we carved up the country. We had to do that so that we could get to at least one Zoom room for each state. That was our goal. But as you can see, we've now completed these 5 road shows, and we still have another Q&A session that took place actually just this afternoon to be able to try to answer questions. And our team is continuing to field questions on the engines at nsf.gov email address as well. And I'll just note that the concept outlines for both planning and development grants, as well as full-fledged engines, are due by the end of this month, with deadlines for the type 1, the planning and development grants later on in this calendar year as well. And we'll announce type 2 deadlines here in the not too distant future. So I hope that that gives you a sense for sort of the inspiration behind this new directorate, gives you a sense for some of the key functional aspects of this directorate, and also emphasizes, at least in this case, one key program that we see as a flagship for how we're going to be able to execute on this mission and this vision for this directorate. The last thing that I'll say before I wrap is a little bit about diversity, equity, inclusivity, and accessibility, right? So I'd argue that for too long, I've said this already today, NSF has, and other funding agencies have struggled to be able to meet folks where they are and to engage folks where they are. And so that's why in the lead up to the Engines program, in the lead up to establishing this directorate, we actually ran a series of roadshows where we tried to engage with different types of institutions and individuals at those different types of institutions to understand more meaningfully what are some of the challenges to engaging with NSF. How can we structure programs differently to put folks more on an equivalent playing field, right? And based off of that, took away some learnings in terms of the challenges to building strong partnerships, challenges associated with geographic isolation, challenges to capacity building at institutions, the fact that NSF policies sometimes are limiting in terms of how much time we actually pay of faculty members, the value of mentoring across regional and geographic boundaries as well, where you can have other institutions provide mentoring in a positive and constructive way as well. And so this has actually inspired us, for instance, with the concept outlines for the Engines program. Just to be sure everybody saw it, we're going to publish all of the concept outlines that we get at the end of this month. Why? Because we want to put the type 1s and type 2s on a more level and equal playing field. So that if I have a type 1 operating in a particular region and a type 2 operating in that particular region as well, they know that and they can foster some teaming on a level playing field, as opposed to later on a type 2 swooping in and getting the award and the funding that NSF might have. So with that, I'll just close by saying we're really delighted to be able to launch this new directorate. Really delighted that we've been able to reposition some existing programs and kickstart the Engines, as well as some other flagship investments through TIP. If you're interested in working at NSF, please let me know. We're recruiting for a whole directorate, so I need help on that front. But maybe the most important place where I'll end is this Valley of Death slide that I guess Tom had shown some time ago. It's been modified a little bit, but the story is still the same, right? If you think about where that Valley of Death exists, it exists between the public funding on the foundational research, largely on the foundational research, less so even on use-inspired research, and certainly on proofs of concept. And between that and private funds from industry, for instance, that really accelerate commercialization and product development in the nearer term, right? And so when I look at that Valley of Death, I see not a valley of death, but I see a ramp of opportunity for the TIP directorate. And I see a ramp of opportunity for us to be able to fill in that gap with mechanisms, with programs, with investments, if we have the appropriate level of resourcing, that allows us to be able to, again, help folks build those bridges across that Valley of Death, and really inspires a different kind of research that brings together users and beneficiaries and consumers with our researchers to shape those efforts from the very beginning. So I hope this is helpful. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And I guess if there's time, I'm happy to take some questions.
There is absolutely time, since I've been the one that's been tasked to keep us on schedule. So I'd like to open it up if somebody wants to raise their hand, and we've got microphones, I hope, out there, right over here. And as we did before, if you could just identify yourself before you ask your question.
Tom Peterson.
I know.
Used to be at NSF. This is really exciting. And this is maybe a rather pedestrian logistics question, but NSF has really been, known internationally for more than anything, its process of review and how research programs are selected and peer reviewed. And it's primarily been in the purview of academics. So given this importance of evaluating the contributions to community and contributions to business and industry, how might that process change in order to keep that same high level of standard?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. This is not, can this work? Can we turn this mic on? Great. So that's a great question, Tom. I'm just going to rove here for a little bit. I'm more comfortable doing that. So let me just say that the short answer to your question is that process absolutely has to change. And for the last year and a half, we've been thinking about ways in which we can orchestrate that change. So not to say that overnight, we're going to move from, for those of you who know NSF, the National Science Board, our governing body, imposes a couple of review criteria: intellectual merit and broader impacts. What's the technical innovation that we're going to see, and how is it going to benefit society at the end of the day? And I think that we will continue to have those review criteria as as at a high level for the engines program, for instance. But we're going to think very closely and carefully about what are the specific criteria additionally that we really need to have in the context of what it is that we're trying to do for a given program. So in the context of the engines, I'm sure all of you have seen, we have a specific set of review criteria for the engines program explicitly. That also means, to your point, Tom, that we're going to need to think about, just as I want proposals that involve folks from academia and industry and government and nonprofits and civil society and communities of practice and national labs, I want to be sure that the reviewers themselves have that same footprint and perspective that they bring to the table too, right? And so we've been hard at work trying to think about who might our reviewers be for a program like the Engines program or for other programs within TIP. How can we build those networks? And to the extent that I can get your help in this room to help us with that, I welcome it.
Other questions?
Thank you. Hi, Eric Rasmussen from Singularity University and a couple of other places. Can you talk about the non-standard geographies that maybe were represented on the map, but maybe not? So will you fund engines, for example? Will TIP be interested in Indian reservations, Native American reservations inside the US? The COFA allies like Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands. I saw Puerto Rico illustrated up there. That's a non-standard location. Can you talk a little bit about those?
I can just simply say yes. I can simply say yes to your question. Okay. I mean, look, I think that it's critically important for us to think, again, I talked on the slides that it's important and it's incumbent upon the region to coalesce together, a coalition of the willing. And it's important for that region to specify what are the specific societal or economic drivers, what are the specific technology areas that we can focus in on, right? If a region does that, and it may be a Native American reservation, an Indian reservation, it may be Puerto Rico, right? It may be different parts of the country. The short answer to your question is absolutely. We are looking for those types of proposals.
Tom Campbell, representing Future Grass as well as Bootstrap Labs and venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. So I'm curious, in the Valley of Death, one of the problems with Valley of Death is, generally speaking, a lot of these new companies don't have the funding. So VCs can provide that. I'm curious if NSF has engaged in its roadshow with VCs, angel investors, high net worth individuals, and so forth. And if not, how can we help you?
So first of all, let's talk. No doubt. Second of all, we have been trying to engage with the VC community. So let me just note, this stat is public, and some of you may have seen it. If you have, I apologize for telling you something you already know. But in the first webinar, we had 2,600 individuals signing in for that webinar for the Regional Innovation Engines program. 47% were not from academic institutions. To me, that's a mark of success, an initial mark of success. I would have loved for the number to be 51, but it's okay. I'll take 47. And of those, there was a sizable number that was the VC community, right? We've continued to try to engage with the VC community through our roadshows. We've continued to try to be a point of entry for the VC community and angel investors and so forth. I think that you're absolutely right. It's a combination of our SBIR program, as well as investments through the VC world together that allow us to be able to get some of these companies and organizations across the Valley of Death. I'd love to have a deeper conversation with you and your broader network.
Thank you. I'm Ali Nsf Mission, I'm a finance professor here. The value of debt that you showed, I'm gonna give you an example in history of innovation. Faraday discovered the electricity in early 1800. The electric revolution didn't start in 1950. That's 150 years of constant discovery, solving puzzles, but more so because during that time, the steam engine revolution and then the American Industrial Revolution was happening at the same time. So bridging that gap sometimes is not about just intervening. It's about going against the natural evolution of technological processes. What's your take on that?
So I think, let me just say, and I hope you would agree with this, it's a combination of the two, right? There are going to be times where you go against the natural grain. There are going to be times where I think we do need mechanisms to be able to bridge, right? I'm not proposing to completely solve the Valley of Death problem exclusively out of NSF or exclusively by my team or myself, right? But I think that there are certain levers that we have access to by virtue of if we were to invest additionally through certain mechanisms that we know we could potentially put out onto the street. And so I think that it's incumbent upon us to think about where can NSF engage and where can NSF make a difference? Obviously working with our colleagues across other agencies and beyond. And then you're absolutely right. There are going to be some innovations that take a significant amount of time, and you can't necessarily accelerate that exclusively through NSF investment, and that's okay. But for the ones that we can, we should be doing that. I hope that's fair. By the way, there's a great article about Pasteur's quadrant and Pasteur and how long it took for some of those innovations to actually surface when you think about use-inspired research. So I hear you.
I think we have a question back there.
Mine's more of a comment. Again, Margaret Donahue, head of the US office for CSIRO. And a couple months ago, we launched a collaboration on the Convergence Accelerator with NSF, and have noticed some great success in engaging Australian researchers and industry to partner with the US. So already seeing a lot of success from that. And we hope to expand that.
Yeah. So thanks for your partnership and collaboration. I had an opportunity to meet with a couple of your colleagues when they visited with NSF. There's a lot of excitement, not just in the community, but there's a lot of excitement at NSF around these types of synergistic collaborations that are among like-minded democracies like ours.
Another final question or two? Otherwise, we will, oh, one more in the back there.
Hi, Penelope Shihab, Director of Wyoming Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. First of all, congratulations for TIP creation. This is so exciting for us.
Thank you.
I have two questions. Are you guys in TIP considering international innovation partnerships? And if yes, where are the regions you're considering, like worldwide? The other part is back to the valley. I always see the scientists and researchers stuck in the commercialization phase in their journey from the lab to the market. usually they don't know what exactly to do, and it's a turning point for them. So do you have, or do you consider, or is there any program via Engine to help them to overcome this commercialization step and decide where exactly they want to go? Thank you.
Great questions. All of these have been great questions, by the way. So on the first one, let me say that you heard a little bit about this partnership with CSIRO in Australia. And I'll give you another example of one. So we are preparing here in the not too distant future to launch a prize challenge. So part of TIP is thinking through not just topical areas, not just the geography of innovation, but the mechanisms by which we support science as well, right? And so the agency, not that the agency has never done this before, we've run prize challenges in the past, but can we leverage prize challenges to a particular effect as well? And so we're getting ready to announce a prize challenge with our colleagues in the UK, as well as with our colleagues at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, here in the US, specifically focused on privacy enhancing technologies. And how do I bring some of these privacy techniques like secure multi-party computation or fully homomorphic encryption that have been pioneered in the lab? How do I bring them to bear in a practical setting? Right? So thinking about use-inspired research, thinking about accelerating that translation of those research results to practice. Part of that requires practical problems in the financial technology space, financial crime space, for instance. Part of that requires bringing folks together to really think about problems in that way. So those are now two examples, Australia and the UK. And I think, again, bear with us, we started on March 16th, but over time you will see that we will be building out relationships. And I have to say it, we'll be building out relationships with countries that share our democratic values. So that's number one on that point. To your second question about helping folks in terms of entrepreneurial capacity building, right? And helping them sort of be able to step through that valley of death and know where to go. So there are several points of that, right? One is I'm in a research lab, I'm working on a research problem. And if I had some guidance from some commercialization advisors, even from the very beginning, maybe that might take me in a particular direction. And maybe that would make my work all the more impactful in the nearer term, right? So that's one point of intersection. Another point of intersection is, okay, I now have done research for some time and I have some result. And now I want to take that result to the market or to some societal impact in some meaningful way, right? So there are these different time points, and there are others that I just didn't highlight, but just to give you 2-point examples. So on that latter one, we have had a longstanding program called I-Core, which really tries to help researchers with customer discovery and market fitness. So I have this research output. I'm interested in trying to see what is the market for that particular research output. Is there even a customer in the first place, right? So part of our goal with TIP, which now houses the I-Core program, is to be able to scale the investment that we make in I-Core so that it really does touch the full geography of the country. If you ask me today, I'd be the first person to say that our I-Core hubs today are not fully distributed across the country, for example. Then earlier on in the research process, when you're in the lab, and you're thinking about potential new directions that you might take or branch points that you might take in the research that you're doing, you know, we have ideas and aspirations for ways in which we might be able to partner with researchers in that realm as well. So the short answer to your question is yes, but I wanted to give you a little bit of sort of perspective on how we're thinking about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we've
Thank you all.
taken more of your time and you're very generous with it.